This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we simply cannot thank you enough. This interview is part of a series recorded on the occasion of a conference titled Democracy and Its Alternatives, The Origins of Israel's Current Crisis. It was held earlier this year at Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies and organized in collaboration with the Center for Jewish History in New York. My guest, a fellow at the Schusterman Center's Institute for Advanced Israel Studies, was one of the participants. Dr. Nimrod is a historian, the managing editor of the Journal of Israeli History. His research focuses on the history of the demographic discourse in Zionism, which is the topic of his forthcoming book, People Who Count, Zionism, Demography and Democracy in Mandate Palestine. Dr. Nimrod, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you for having me.
So the Balfour Declaration, which consolidated the British commitment to the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, famously stated that, and I quote, "Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine," end quote, which was later derided because the so-called existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine were an overwhelming majority in the country when the declaration was delivered in 1917. Now, when the Zionists celebrated this feat, the Balfour Declaration, which was indeed enormous, were they conscious of this potential landmine?
Very much so. I mean, it begins even before the Balfour Declaration. Weizmann comes to Palestine around 1918, actually after the Balfour Declaration, but before the issue of the mandate itself. And from the very beginning, he starts writing letters to Balfour, to other British dignitaries about how the British officials are giving preference to the Palestinians because they're the majority. And he actually says the Jews are qualitatively better than the Palestinians, and so the democratic principle doesn't apply to Palestine. And there's an entire discourse coming out of Weizmann, who, as an aside, we should say is considered a moderate, about how we shouldn't apply majority rule to Palestine from the very beginning, before there's an actual mandate.
So was this grounded in any international parallels or perhaps the political culture of, the British Empire at the time?
Not really. I mean, what's interesting about the mandate is that it's the first time in which the British are basically trying to recreate the world in a more ethical way. I mean, after every major conflict, the British or any victorious empire is restructuring the world. But during the First World War, or at least in the latter stages of the war becomes about democracy, especially with Wilson coming into the fray and the 14 points and all of that, and so you can't create new entities that don't pay lip service to some extent to the democratic principle. But Britain is still an empire and it still wants to rule the Middle East. So the compromise and the mandate really is about how do we do colonialism ethically, and specifically in Palestine, how do we do settler colonialism ethically? And the compromise is you're not going to have Jewish rule or any kind of sovereignty before there's a Jewish majority. And that's a completely new, and as far as I can tell, a pretty unique feature of settling movements. You know, when the British come to New Zealand, when they come to Australia, they're not counting the natives. They don't care. They are the sovereigns in the name of Britain and for as an effect of being white. That is not the case in Palestine. And this is why Mandate Palestine is such an interesting political laboratory.
Because the British actually said until you have a majority, that you have no right to set up your national home.
It's not in the mandate. It's not anywhere. But there is correspondence between the Zionists and the British that basically says that, like, we are giving you a chance to bring as many Jews as you can bring, and if we decide to give Palestine sovereignty, and if at that time there's a Jewish majority, then there's going to be some kind of Jewish rule.
We're talking about what years, because this is still a time when the British did not restrict Jewish immigration into Palestine.
Right, but they restrict. I mean, before they restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine in 22, the Zionist organization restricts Jewish immigration to Palestine because they can't handle the mass of people. And again, as an aside, this is the time where there are mass pogroms in the Ukraine. And the Zionist organization says, we can't bring that many people in. Like, we have to bring the people who are going to revolutionize Jewish existence. We can't bring refugees. Saving refugees.
Looking for pioneers rather than refugees.
Exactly. You need to bring in the early 1920s, Zionism is about saving Judaism rather than saving Jews. I think this is one of the major sort of contradictions within Zionism. Zionism isn't one thing, and there's a part of Zionism that's about saving Jews. I think that's ironically something that Herzl was very passionate about, even though when we talk about Herzl, it's usually about Jewish honor and all that stuff, but he was looking for to save Jews from Europe. This is why he was for the Kenyan or Ugandan settlement scheme. And there are other Zionists, the Zionists who sort of won against Herzl, who said, we need to save Judaism, we can't bring refugees.
So this is why the demography the immigration was restricted in the first place. And so what did it entail for the prospects of demographic growth, and as a byproduct of that, the whole national question? I mean, the question of the issue of sovereignty.
Well, the Zionist plan, again in the early 1920s, this is going to take decades. Right, we want a lot of people to come in, but we also want to be in control of those people. We want to select they're very, very gung-ho on selection. And so they don't really, in the first 5 years, they don't really care about mass immigration. The problem is that as part of the mandate, and again, this new way of conducting or doing imperialism, the British are committed to create self-governing institution in Palestine. And that means creating a legislative council, which was supposed to be a quasi-parliament with Jewish and Arab and British delegates. And the legislative council was supposed to be, the seats were distributed proportionally, which means that you would have had an Arab majority. And then the Zionists are in a bind. They comprise about 10% of the population, and there's a threat of an Arab majority that might block Jewish immigration. And then, from my perspective, this is where you see the rise of Zionist binationalism. Right, the Zionist binationalism, or at least mainstream Zionist binationalism, arises from the challenge of the Legislative Council in 1924, after the elections to the Legislative Council, which, by the way, the Jews participated in and the Palestinians boycotted. The worker parties are they're having their annual conference, and they're sitting there and they say, we dodged a bullet. How do we make sure that this is not going to happen again? And David Ben-Gurion, who was also a pretty important Zionist political thinker, comes up with the idea of mutual non-dominance, which means that Jews are not going to dominate Arabs, and Arabs are not going to dominate Jews. And in parentheses, this means that the British are going to dominate both, right? The whole structure of mainstream Zionist binationalism is really dependent on the British, because
So this is what you call Zionist binationalism, the mutual non-domination.
right.
Yeah. So basically, it's not perhaps not an ethical binationalism, if you will. It's an instrumental one. It's just because they couldn't garner a majority, so the second best option would be this Zionist binationalism.
It's a question that I don't think I can answer, even after working on it for 10 years. There's a huge debate. It's not that relevant anymore, but in the last decade, there was a huge debate between the old guard Zionists, people like Anita Shapira and Yosef Goni, who said Zionist binationalism or mainstream Zionist binationalism, people like Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, this was completely tactical, right? This is completely a way to block Arab majority rule. And then comes Dimitri Shumsky and says, no, this was part of Zionist ideology. And I think that the truth is somewhere in between, because if this was just a ruse, you would have protocols that are treating it as just a ruse. It would be like a PR move, right? But you have hundreds and thousands of pages of closed Hebrew language forums that are for internal use only, that debate the ideology and the ethical aspect of binationalism. So it's somewhere in the middle. They wouldn't propose it if, to some extent, they didn't believe in it.
But what would it mean for the Zionist project if there was like a binational? I mean, how would it play out in practice?
Right. So Ben-Gurion in 1929 gives you a plan, and the plan says we're basically going to have the mandate until there's a Jewish majority, and after there's a Jewish majority, we're going to federalize Palestine, and you're going to have a bicameral parliament. The upper house is going to be a Senate that's divided equally between Jews and Arabs. That was called parity. Parity was a huge part of the Zionist binational agenda, right? It doesn't matter how many people live in Palestine. The institutions are always going to be divided between Jews and Arabs equally. But, he said, there's also going to be a lower house, which was going to be like the House of Commons, which is elected proportionally. And since you have a Jewish majority at the time, you're going to have basically some sort of Jewish political hegemony that is hemmed in by the Senate, by British supervision, by the League of Nations. So binationalism, at least according to Ben-Gurion, is still dependent on a Jewish majority. It's just a Jewish majority that doesn't have complete sovereignty.
But in the absence of a Jewish majority, which was the reality,
then you have to postpone any kind of majority rule indefinitely. And there was a huge Zionist campaign against the Legislative Council, which created an entire democratic
that worked, by the way, right?
That worked in 1936, a month before the Arab Revolt. The Parliament, the British Parliament, ironically, this is a deeply ironic discussion, votes against the establishment of a legislative council in Palestine, and the plan basically dies. And it was one of the major triggers of the Arab Revolt. And if I can say as an aside, we see this pattern in the Israeli-Arab conflict or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict again and again, where the Zionists or the Israelis block diplomatic measures, and that is followed by Palestinian violence. And in the case of the mandate, it usually means that in the end, there are concessions against Zionism, because the Arab Revolt leads to the 1939 White Paper.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, the Legislative Council is dead by 1936. It never comes close to being established. There's a very, very effective campaign in the British media, in the British Parliament, and one of the tenets of this campaign is from the Zionist point of view, is we're only going to participate in the Legislative Council if there's parity between Jews and Arabs. And the whole thing of mutual non-domination is whatever the demography is on the ground, there's always going to be equality, political equality between Jews and Arabs. But they also had other arguments that are less, let's call it, progressive. For example, there was a whole side of the campaign that told you how Palestinians are backwards and they are not fit for democracy, and that it is outrageous that a Bedouin would have the same vote as a European Jew. The guy who said this is Leo Cohen, who wrote one of the drafts for the Israeli constitution that never was. So that, to me, that's really interesting. Another idea from Chaim Arlozorov, was to have literary or property qualifications, with the idea that because such a big percentage of the Palestinian population is poor or illiterate, they wouldn't have the right to vote. So there's a darker side to this campaign. One side is the parity side, which is very, very progressive. The other side is a little more ethically complex.
Mm-hmm. Another player that looms large in this story, even though he's outside of the mainstream Jewish Zionist leadership, is Vladimir Jabotinsky, who, as you say, was one of the early proponents of a Jewish majority as a sine qua non for the Zionist enterprise. How did his well-known rivalry with Labor Zionism and Ben Gurion around that issue, how did it play out?
Well, one of the big part of the Zionist tactic was not to talk about demographics, right? Whenever you would ask publicly Weizmann or Ben Gurion, they would say, we just want free immigration. And it might be possible that one day this free immigration might lead to a Jewish majority, but that's not for us to say. That's something that future generations are going to have to deal with. And for Jabotinsky, this was an anathema to Zionist honor and to Zionist truth, right? You can't fool people.
Well, he saw it as dishonest,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, the difference between Jabotinsky and Weizmann is that Weizmann is consistently at the helm of the Zionist leadership, and he has to carry out Zionist policy, and he's in constant connection with the British. He knows what they want. Jabotinsky is always in the opposition. I mean, he's a very important part of the opposition, but he doesn't have any responsibility. So he can say whatever he wants. And for his crowd, he's playing to his base. For his crowd, saying what you mean is super important. But Weizmann knows that talking about being a Jewish majority, even if you mean it, is bad for business. This is bad optics. And it's only during the Fifth Aliyah in the mid-1930s that you start to see Zionist leaders outside of Jabotinsky start to talk about a Jewish majority. And even then, it's always qualified in some way.
Because there was a more substantial demographic base by the late 1930s?
The Fifth Aliyah basically changes Zionist politics. By 1935, Ben Gurion and Moshe Sharet start talking about, they don't talk about a Jewish state, but they talk about a policy towards a Jewish state. And up until that point, no one officially talks about a Jewish state. You talk about the national home, you talk about mass immigration, but you don't say et Hashem HaMeforash, right? So the Fifth Aliyah changes the demography of Palestine in 3 years. I mean, the magnitude of this Aliyah cannot be overstated. It was 70% in 3 years. You had the immigration was equal to 70% of the Jewish population of Palestine. It more than doubles it. And suddenly the Zionist leadership starts looking ahead, and they say, if this kind of tempo of immigration continues for 10 years, we might be the majority. Maybe parity, maybe mutual non-domination is not such a good idea. And you start to see very gradually in 1934, 1935 that Ben-Gurion and Sharet are saying, well, maybe we don't want to have a legislative council at all, even if you agree to parity. And then comes the Arab revolt, which again changes everything once again.
Because of the restrictions that were made on immigration, and then they had to recalculate future prospects.
The Arab majority was a resounding success for the Palestinians. It also destroyed them, right? It was
the Arab revolt.
The Arab revolt. It was the definition of a Pyrrhic victory, but because the British basically did the work for the Zionists, they obliterated Palestinian society, but the Arab revolt gave excuse to the British to restrict not just Jewish immigration, but the entire Jewish colonization project, right? The British know that they're going to war with either Germany or Italy. There was a war in Ethiopia between the Italians and the Ethiopians, and suddenly Italy is sitting on the back of Egypt. And the British know that they have to rally their Middle Eastern partners. And that means that they have to cater to Palestinian demands. And that leads to restrictions on Jewish immigration and land purchases. And that starts from 1936, right? We usually think about 1939 as the watershed moment, but it really is 3 years earlier. It's just gradual. And in 1939, it becomes official.
So what do the Zionists do? I mean, up until that moment, they were picturing a Jewish majority in 10 years' time, and then their hopes are dashed.
Well, that splits the Zionist organization or the Zionist movement, because the revisionists are outside the Zionist organization. For the proponents of partition, it's pretty clear. The British have abandoned us. The only way to create a Jewish majority is a Jewish state. And it's a terrible loss. They all say it. It's a terrible loss. We are going to miss Hebron and Nablus and all that, but we have to do it. So that answer is easy. For the opponents of partition, it's a tougher sell, because what they're saying is basically we're going to go back to Ottoman times, where we operated under a hostile government, and we're going to do this for 5, 10, 20 years. But at some point, the British or someone else is going to come in, and they're going to let us basically settle in the entire land of Israel. And by 1937, almost everyone in the Zionist movement is for a Jewish nation state. But the question really is about where and when this state is going to be established, right? The pro-partitionists want a Jewish state now in parts of Palestine because they see the state as an immigration tool, right? But there was a big section of the Zionist organization, I think about half, that says, we don't want a Jewish state that much. The territory is as important to us as the state.
And how was this conflict resolved in the end?
It wasn't really, because the British withdrew the partition proposal, and then you basically had 7 years, or from 1939 to 1945, 46, where everyone was waiting for the war to be over. Right, the white paper is May 1939. So the entire period of the Second World War is everyone waiting to see what was going to happen after the war. It was just a waiting game, and in the time, by the way, the Jewish national home did grow. I mean, there were fewer immigrants, but they bought land. They brought in illegal immigrants. There was growth there. And then after the war, basically, Ben-Gurion was able to bulldoze his way into forcing the entire Zionist organization to rally behind a nation state. But there is a question there, which is something that I'm thinking about. How late was this rallying around the nation state idea? Because I think that the common narrative is that we always wanted a nation state, and then Chomsky came and said, "Well, some of us wanted a binational state," and now I think there's a good reason to say most Zionists were willing to remain under British rule, maybe until 1942, maybe 1945, maybe even 1947, because imperial protection was so important that it was worth postponing the state.
Really interesting. But as it turns out, what you just said about the late 1930s and the early 1940s, that it was moving in the direction of Jewish majority nation state. What does it do to really reconsider what you said about the ambiguity of the mutual non-domination before? I mean, doesn't it prove the original position of the classical historians, as you said? Once the question of demography seemed like it was going to resolve itself, they moved in the direction of Jewish majority rather than any sort of ethical binationalism.
One of the things I think we are learning now through my research and other people's research is that Zionist ideology is very, very flexible,
elastic,
yeah. And or at least it used to be in the 1920s and 1930s, and it comes, I think, from a point of or from a place of political weakness. But really, one of the constant, is that you need a Jewish majority, and that has to do with the way Zionists view the world. For them, the Jewish problem came from the fact that Jews were a minority everywhere. So a Jewish majority was non-negotiable. But you can have a Jewish majority in a binational state. And my impression, and it's just an impression, I can't prove it, there's no smoking gun, is that if the Palestinians were willing to go down the binational path and willing to allow for a binational state with a Jewish majority, Ben-Gurion would have taken it. At any point, Ben-Gurion is looking for the path of least resistance. And in 1930s, it looks like binationalism is the path of least resistance. And really, the Arab Revolt is a terrible breaking point for the Zionist movement, because it's so connected to the British. And then they have to recalculate everything about their political philosophy. I mean, the political philosophy up until 1936 is that we're going to have a Jewish majority, and this Jewish majority is going to lead very naturally to a Jewish state. And with partition, really, what the British are saying, you're going to have a state in a territory that doesn't have a Jewish majority. And so you really have to think about, okay, so how do you create a Jewish state? Never mind a democratic Jewish state, if half of your population is Palestinian. And the Peel Commission says you're going to transfer them out. And really at that point, population transfer becomes one of the most important tools in the Zionist political toolkit.
Up until then, they had not considered it.
They had, but in a very different way. Up until that point, population transfer is imagined or fantasized as a way to solve specific social problems. So in the early 1930s, when Weizmann, for example, talks about transfer, he talks about transferring landless Palestinian peasants who were whose land was both bought by Zionists and were left without a livelihood. And Weizmann says, let's put them in Transjordan. Right? And he's saying that while proposing settling Jews in Transjordan. So this is not getting rid of Palestinians. This is just, it isn't getting rid of Palestinians in the same way. It's just moving them to another part of the mandate. And it's not this is not ethnic cleansing, right? It purports to be surgical. in 1937, when the Peel Commission comes in, we're talking about ethnic cleansing. We're talking about taking out 80%, 90% of the Arab population of the Jewish state. This is about creating a homogeneous nation state, a completely different procedure.
Alongside that, did they imagine an Arab minority within the Jewish majority state and all sorts of, political arrangements that would make that work?
It's interesting because they start out from the League of Nations position, which is minority treaties. There were minority treaties that applied especially to Jews all across Eastern Europe, and they were supposed to safeguard the rights of Jews, but they failed miserably, and most of those states like Poland and Romania absolutely walked all over them. And so there are a lot of interesting discussion about the Arab minority in 1937, 1938, when the Zionists think there's going to be a partition, and they start from the position, okay, they're going to have minority rights, but in order to have minority rights, there has to be transfer. So transfer and democracy.
Why does there have to be transfer? Because they have to be a minority first?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The amount or the overall extent of your rights as a minority depends on your demographic side.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a state with 50% Arabs, some Zionists said, we might not have a democracy for the first 10 years because you need 10 years to bring in immigrants to create a very robust Jewish majority. And one of the things that Ben-Gurion talks about again and again is that a 51% majority is not a majority. And that continues deep into Israeli history, right? That 51% is not, we can see it, I think, even today, that where you need at least 60% Jews in order for Israel to be a democracy. And it was definitely true in the 1930s. Ben-Gurion says again and again, we're going to have an interim period in which is either going to be some sort of Jewish government or Jewish or British supervision with.
That's after partition.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
Partition was going to be gradual, right? So they're going to. Ostensibly, the League of Nations is going to decide for partition because the League of Nations is a sort of the organization that decides what happens, and then you're going to have a very long period where the mandate sort of reassembles as two nation states, right? And in that time, the British are still going to have to control the area, but hopefully, again, from a Zionist point of view, the Jewish agency is going to have control of immigration. And instead of bringing in 20,000 people, 30,000 people, 40,000 people, they're going to bring 60,000 people, 80,000 people, 100,000 people. And again, at that point in 1937, there are 400,000 Jews in Palestine. So bringing 100,000 people in 1 year is a gargantuan effort. But this is the Zionist plan. And then within, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you're going to have a robust majority, and then you're going to have a Jewish state. There's going to be some sort of Jewish control of the land beforehand, but you're only going to have a Jewish state or Jewish sovereignty when there's a majority. Like there's a very, very clear sequence of events.
How did this sort of like instinct or logic prevail after with the establishment of the State of Israel and, in 1948 and the aftermath? So two major game-changing events. One is the Nakba, and the other is, of course, the mass immigration post-1948. So in a way, the battle was decided, right, in the favor of Zionist demographics, right? The numbers are now not even close. Yet it seems that this whole demographic logic persisted within the Israeli political culture at the time, and even now up until today?
Well, this is what I'm actually thinking about right now as an extension of the book we were talking about. The whole thing. I mean, the literature about nation state is very clear that in the interwar period, the 1920s, 1930s, everyone wanted to create a homogeneous nation state. And we can see it to some extent in Zionist history. We definitely see it after the state is established. I mean, the Nakba is really about creating this homogeneous nation state. But as early as 1956, the first occupation of Gaza, Ben-Gurion is seriously thinking about annexing the Gaza Strip with a substantial Palestinian population. And in 1967, the Israeli government decides, or rather decides not to decide, to hold on to a huge Palestinian population. I think there was about 1 million Palestinian people in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip then, against maybe 3 Israeli Jews. That's a huge demographic plus, right? And since 1967, you see an entire apparatus designed to allow Israel to control the territory without bringing the Palestinian into the Jewish body politic, right? So you can have this oxymoron where you don't necessarily have a robust Jewish majority in all of Israel, Palestine, but you have a Jewish and democratic state.
Going back to what you said about Ben-Gurion's thinking of annexing the Gaza Strip when it was occupied during the Sinai campaign in 1956, how did he justify it demographically and politically?
Well, they thought there were less or fewer Palestinians than there actually were. I think they thought it was more about the refugees than the people who were in Gaza before that. They thought there were only about 100,000 refugees. When they discovered there were about 3 times more, they said, well, maybe this is a bad idea. And then the US and the USSR came in and said, you're not going to have it anyway, so it's a moot point. But there is an alternative history where the Ben-Gurion government thinks that occupying the strategic value of the Gaza Strip is so important that you're going to have to swallow down these extra few 100,000 Palestinians. And you have to remember that the military government is still in effect, and the military government allows you to have
military government of Israeli Arabs.
So in this alternative history, the Palestinians are incorporated into the military government, and so you don't really have to think about democracy.
Citizenship,
right?
Mm-hmm.
So Israel is really backing away from the whole homogeneous nation state pretty early. I would say that the heyday of a homogeneous nation state as a political idea is between 1937 and let's say 1967, although you could argue for 56. And out of 140 years of Zionist history, 30 years is not that much. And what you have before 1937 and after 1967 is more of an imperial thinking. And what we're seeing now is a challenge from the Zionist right to the whole idea that a Jewish majority is necessary for the legitimacy of the Jewish state.
Because the numbers are working against the Jews.
Right. Their plan, at least until October 7, was to mostly annex the West Bank. Now they're thinking about Gaza, and we've seen it in the news lately. And in order to do that, you need to find a way to garner international legitimacy. It's less about what's happening in the Israeli public for a state which controls 45, 50% Palestinians, right? And the idea is that you turn Israel into a more theocratically oriented country, and there's a huge...
some would say an apartheid state.
Right.
I mean, this is what it means in
But
practice. No?
there are versions of the. I mean, the annexation discourse has blown up in recent years. There are versions, like the more humane version of Reuven Rivlin, the former president, says we're going to basically give citizenship to everyone, and God bless us, and
But that really echoes what you just said about Jabotinsky back in the
Right.
1930s. I mean, it's sort of a similar idea, isn't it?
And again, because Rivlin is not really a political player, he can say that. The other versions are,
Just like Jabotinsky. No?
right, exactly.
Yeah.
This is, it's a really wonderful place to be when you're in opposition, but you're respected and you don't have actual responsibility. It's a great job if you can get it. But when you look at the actual people in Otzma Yehudit and the religious right, there are basically two versions. Either you annex only Area C, right, which is where most of the settlements are, and then you can give those Palestinians who live there citizenship because there's relatively few of them. But if you're annexing all of the West Bank, they're basically going to be residents, right, with some rights but no voting rights, which is really where the bone of contention is, right? So these are two versions. And I would say my hunch is that if Area C is going to be annexed, that's only the aperitif, right? They're not going to settle for Area C only unless the U.S. or someone equally powerful intervenes.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at a point right now, especially in the war, especially in what's going on in Gaza, where we might see a real revolution, not just in the territory under Israeli control, but in the way Israeli politics are conducted, right? We thought about ourselves as a Jewish nation state. We might be a Jewish empire.
Basically, this is where the internal Israeli political discourse is going rather than, I mean, do you see any viability for that on the, the diplomatic surroundings and international law? I mean, it can be said that it's just, childish fantasies of some people in government, but the problem is that they're very powerful, childish people.
There's absolutely no legitimacy to this, as far as I can tell, and the war has certainly shifted the discourse the other way around. But since
the international discourse,
international discourse, and I'm not sure how much someone like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich really care about international legitimacy. And again, it's very important to look at how they are positioned within the Israeli government. They're the bad boys, right? Netanyahu, who's not a very responsible person, has to be the responsible adult here and sort of back them away. But if Ben-Gvir or Smotrich win the next election or the election afterward, which is not a far-fetched scenario, you might see Israel going full rogue state, right? Where international legitimacy doesn't really matter anymore, and you're rallying around the idea of this God-given right of Jews to rule all over the land of Israel.
God bless us all. Dr. Nimrod Lin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
And many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies for the generous support. And now we've got a request, because most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto a Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.